Well, welcome everybody to No Dice, No Glories HMGS Roundtable Part 2. And here we are getting ready for night 3, getting into the home stretch, as we like to call it. And today we have with us a special guest all the way from down under. And we have Mike Haught from Scary Biscuits Games. And we're going to
Hey,
talk about something I love to talk about, which is naval miniatures. Mike, welcome.
thanks for having me. This is going to be exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, we're excited. So a lot of people out there don't know, but you've got some long game experience and some pedigree out there. So if you want to talk about some of your previous works,
Yeah.
and if you become shy, I'm just going to pull the books from my shelf and just show them here. So I'll let you brag for a minute.
All right. Yeah. So I got started in the industry in 2007. I was, as you can tell from my accent, I'm actually from the U.S. of A. I was born and raised in Washington State and Idaho in that area. So that's where I'm originally from. But in 2007, I answered a call. I was at uni and was doing some history, and I went to. I was really into just tabletop games in general, card games, things like that. And a guy said, "Hey, have you ever heard of this game called Flames of War?" And I said, "I have not." And this would have been 2003. Sorry, just back up a little bit more. It's about 2003. And he said, "Well, you're a historian, you're into games, you should probably look into this game." So I did. I played it for a while, and I really enjoyed it straight away. So that was version 1 back in those days, and really got into it. And well, I was working at our local hobby shop, and I was running events for them, doing big D-Day events, stuff like that. And so when I think it was Fortress Europe, the very Festum Europa, actually, the very first time that came out, we set up a big. It was like the first splash into late war at the time. So we did a big D-Day event. It was really enormous. I documented the whole thing and put it up on the Flames of War boards, and I started kind of getting a little bit of traction from some Battlefront staffers in terms of just interested in what we were doing at the club and stuff like that. So I kind of got in contact with some of the guys there, and then and a couple of years later, a call went out looking for people to do some game design stuff for Battlefront. So I jumped on that, did a bit of a couple of volunteer projects. I did a briefing about the 91st Cavalry back in, this would have been in 2006, well before eventually it became an actual proper force in Casino several years later.
Yeah.
In war. So yeah, so I did a lot of kind of small little like forces. I submitted some stuff through them, and then when the call came out for an actual position at Battlefront, I jumped on that. That would have been 2007. I didn't think that anything was going to come of it because I was all the way in the States, and Battlefront's way down in New Zealand. So I thought, well, we'll just give it a go. And I got a call back about a week later from the guy that was running the studio at the time, Stephen Patak. He was an old cavalry guy, and he had seen my cavalry PDF and was really excited about it. And we ended up chatting for about 2 hours on the phone. And then by the end of it, he said, "Okay, so when can you leave? When can you pack up and be down here in New Zealand?" And I said, as it happened, it was a break in the semester, so I put my master's degree on hold at that point and flew on down. So joined the team in Battlefront in 2007, and I wrote my very first book almost right away. I was down there. I think I was in the office for about 3 days, and Phil said, "Hey, do you want to write a book?" And I was like, what? I had kind of joined the team to do a lot of web stuff, a lot of web support things. I was going to carry on doing what I had been doing before, just a lot of like community stuff and PDFs and things, but they needed a writer right then and there. So I joined, I went under, Phil took me under his wing, and I wrote Stalin's Onslaught was my first book. And then kind of went from there. And so we did, worked at Battlefront for, it was about 8 years, I think, something like that. So a lot of books later. I'd say some of my highlights there were the Market Garden series. I worked a bit with Joe Breeze and his crew in Madison, and he was the MG65 crew. Yeah, that was a really good time, and I really enjoyed putting together those books, the Market Garden series, plus all those really weird, obscure kind of things. I'm a completionist, and one of the things I think I saw it on I want to say Beast of War or something like that. There was an article about gaming in the gaps, and I really enjoyed that. That sort of mentality of being able to make games and make stuff that people don't really know about. There's a lot of the normal stuff that people want to play, like Panzers and Panzer Grenadiers and stuff like that. But I wanted to also bring forward a lot of really strange and bizarre units. So that's what that book was all about, which is why I was so excited about it. That one and
Didn't you do the Italy books too?
yeah. So the Italy books, I did the Casino book originally. That was one of the first ones that that featured a campaign system in it. So the Aces campaign. I worked on that with my brother at the time. He was doing a lot of kind of contributing stuff from overseas. And then after the after that went to print and was quite popular, the Infantry Aces campaign system, then Battlefront brought him across from the States as well. So my brother Andrew worked at Battlefront for several years with me, which was that was pretty awesome too.
I do get you guys mixed up because somebody's like Scary Biscuit Studio, and I said Andy, and they go, "You sure it's the right Haught?" So I'm like,
yeah,
all right,
nope. But yeah, no, he went on to do like tanks and things like that. So
yes, he did.
yeah,
Yes, he
yeah.
did.
Yeah, and so he was really into that, and he's kind of landed in the Gale Force 9 space. So he does a lot of board game design and stuff like that with them right now. So I kind of stuck with the flame side and did mostly I did a lot of I think I retreaded D-Day books about three times, which I ended up going back to Normandy quite a few times. But then in 2015 I took an opportunity to join a studio which was doing digital game design, digital stuff. So I started working on computer games for a little bit, and that was pretty awesome. So I did that for a little while. That was in 2015 to about 2017, and then that studio unfortunately closed its doors. So then,
what games did they put out?
They put out a game called The Etherlight, which was an MMO for kids about ages 10 to 13. That was it was kind of aimed for kids market. And then they did a bunch of AR games for museums and stuff in the States, which were basically you could go into a museum, check out a tablet, and then and give it to the kids. Then they could kind of interact with artifacts in the museum and things, and get some information, play some kind of mini games and stuff like that. So
that's cool.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. So so that studio closed its doors in 2017, and then and Pete, who owns Battlefront, he offered to have me back. So I went back for a year and some change, probably about a year and a half, and I did a bunch more books at Battlefront. So then that's when they started doing version 4 Eastern Front books. So I did the German half of the Eastern Front books, and then I did the American D-Day book as well, and a few other small projects for them. And then after then in 2018, I joined a new studio that was just coming together to do VR work. So we started working in VR. So we're doing, I'm making little game scenarios for that kind of replicate things, training. So we're trying to replace training modules and stuff like the dusty old e-learning training and all that kind of stuff. We're putting that into VR, making it exciting, adding some game elements and things like that. So that's kind of where I'm up to. Yeah,
it needs to get.
Yeah, it's pretty. I've sat through many a health and safety briefing, and it's long and arduous. So anything that can kind of help make that more interesting and more engaging, so far it's been quite good and quite well received. So that's been a lot of fun. But in the meantime, like since I left Battlefront for the first time, not the second time, but when I left the first time, that's when I fired up Scary Biscuit Studios, kind of a way for me to carry on doing physical game design when I moved into the digital space. I knew digital space was a huge learning curve going from physical design work to digital. So I started up Scary Biscuits in, it was a blog well before that, but I kind of turned it into a proper studio at that point as soon as I left Battlefront, because I knew that I wanted a way to keep designing games, because I love it so much, designing games that are physically like physical games. So my friend, it's mostly for collaborations with friends and stuff like that. So we did a game, we did some board games and stuff like that, which never really got published. But the first I'd say 2017, right after that first digital studio closed, I was kind of in a bad space, and my son dug out a project that I'd worked on when I was back in the States, which was my little wooden Jutland fleet. I had a little fleet of Jutland ships, dreadnoughts, and that I had kind of made out of balsa wood, and he wanted to know what those were. So I kind of went into them a bit, and he was really interested in it, and he wanted to know if there was a game for it, because he knows he knew at that time, he was only like 3 or 4, that everything I did had a game behind it. So so he was asking if there's a game. So I sat him down on the floor. We played it. We started rolling some dice just for fun, and then I just it kind of inspired me to get back into pulling out that naval game and kind of dusting it off and giving it a proper go of it. So that was so at about 2017, I started pulling together this idea for a naval game. I applied it first to dreadnoughts, World War I dreadnoughts, and ran that through a bunch of play tests. There's a few little hiccups in that play test, but I rebooted the project about a year ago and as Ironclads. This is the more current version. And I thought that it was because the problem with the dreadnought game, it was getting too wide, too broad, and and I
Yeah, that happens.
yeah, yeah. And I wanted to narrow it down. So I thought, you know what, Civil War Ironclads, it's always something that's been close to my heart. And I thought foolishly at the time, I thought, well, that'll only involve the Monitor and the Merrimack and maybe the Minnesota. And then,
No, sir.
yeah, job done. But no, that was not the case. As soon as I started digging into it, there's hundreds and hundreds of ships that I had no idea. But it was good because it was I kept it small, kept it narrow focused, able to balance the game a little bit easier when there's fewer components, and then you can kind of bolt on components as you go. But then the journey has been really amazing too, just discovering all the different things like riverine battles and stuff like that. So
yeah, so it's funny. I didn't know you were a completionist, but some of my favorite books are ones that you worked on because of the niche lists that are in there. And Market Garden, it's like, well, do you want it of this flavor? Do you want it of that flavor? And Market Garden and the 2 last Italy books are my 3 favorites because there's just so much flavor in those. And I'm the guy that I'm also a completionist, where my Hermann Goering are actually from the Hermann Goering set. And it's probably one of my favorite books. I don't know who actually wrote that Canadian Recce, Armor Recce list in Market Garden, but it's got to be one of my. Is that you?
Yeah, that's one of mine. Yep.
Oh, love that list, man. With those what's it? The 2 fireflies. It's awesome.
Yeah.
So how does a guy that has years of designing games that focus on company level ground combat then start doing naval minis? Because I feel I'm odd because I play both.
Yeah.
But you design both. That's how do you make that jump?
Well, yeah, it's funny because I actually like this game is something I've been wanting to design. It actually predates Flames of War in a way. Like it's been something that's been kind of on my back burner for over 20 years. It's been something that I've been kind of playing around with. When I was it's probably no surprise, but I was a super nerdy kid in high school, and what I did was
we all were.
Yeah. I did. I remember pulling up. I had a book, those old Time Life books, those naval Time Life books that are kind of like leather bound. I had one about dreadnoughts, and they had a picture of HMS Dreadnought in there. And I thought, what I was going to do is I was going to design a game, and this is when I was like 15 or 16. I was going to design a game that was about ship versus ship combat, and kind of got really into. I wanted to get into the weeds about like hit location and all this stuff. Like I had no idea that these games already existed and were much better than the ones I was about to create. But
I wouldn't go much better, but okay.
Yeah. It was something I loaded up Corel Draw at the time. That was my drug of choice, and I just got into making ship designs and stuff like that. So it's been something, and I quickly ran into some roadblocks around like this is crazy, this is a bit nuts. And at the time, I hadn't really evolved as a designer in my mind that I hadn't really considered abstract design. So that was kind of the thing that changed for me at Battlefront, was not everything had to be literal. So I did a lot of literal design prior to going to Battlefront. So everything had to be like, I wanted basically I was trying to make a perfect simulation on the tabletop. It was never going to happen. So,
well, that will teach you.
Yeah. Well, luckily I learned that lesson fairly early on, and that was one of the things that Phil really drove home to me, was that you could abstract a lot of that kind of stuff and really think about what was the story you wanted to tell in your game. And so that was one of the big things when I was doing Stalin's Onslaught. I remember quite vividly, he was quite specific around um, trying to tease out what it was that I wanted to tell. And the story in that book was the breakthrough of around Orsha, because the Germans had such a
Hmm.
tight line of defense there. The Soviets really had to kind of come up with an ingenious way of breaking through that. I mean, it seems on the surface quite blunt. It was basically a hammer that smashed it, but like they had of detailed waves, and they had very purposeful position of troops. So you had mine rollers first, then flamethrowers to burn out any stragglers, and then you had and just so that like every wave was particularly meticulously planned and executed. So that was the story that we wanted to tell. So he kind of that's when he kind of started getting this idea in my head that these kind of special units um, were interesting and worth bringing out. So that it's when you start seeing some of the things like prior to that point in Stalin's Onslaught, a lot of things like IS-2s were mostly a support option, or mine runners were kind of a support option, or they just were kind of not, they were just a thing there. So I wanted to make sure that if in that game that both the Germans and the Soviets had everything they needed to recreate that game. So one of the thing that Phil really inspired in my mind, that's kind of stuck with me ever since, is you give players all of the options that you could possibly give them, all the historical options that you could possibly give them, and let them create that story, recreate that story. You can tell the story in the histories, and that's what the histories in those books was for, is to kind of give them that context. But what I really enjoyed about the way Phil designed, and he continues to design, is he just creates the tools and then he gives them to the players to then dig into and find what is inspiring to them, and find some sort of hook, and then they can double down on that, and then we need to be there to provide all the units and stats and all that kind of stuff, so they can go and have the time of their life exploring what it is that they want to explore. And that was a big jump for me. So when as soon as that clicked in my head, and it clicked more solidly over the course of 7 or 8 years, and so when I hit the naval game again, I think watching, between my son kind of wanting to play the game for the first time, and all the lessons that I had accrued in in the 8 years before that, I started kind of realizing actually there's something to it. Because also the other thing that's kind of coming at this in kind of a weird angle is X-wing and Star Trek Attack Wing. So my son was really into those for a while too, and so
Of course.
yeah, and so it kind of like between those, like there's a lot of stuff that was just kind of like coming in up in my brain. I was like, okay, these things are all kind of coming together. They're kind of solidifying around this. Um, because the thing that always waved me off with working on the naval game, even at Battlefront, working on it as a side project and bringing it up through that studio, it was always that literal mind was still kind of active with that old project. It was still stuck in that gear, and so every time I sat down to think about naval stuff, I kept thinking, you're going to need a gymnasium, you're going to need like laser pointers, you're going to need 50,000 tables, you're going to need
No, you definitely
referees.
know.
Yeah, yeah. And it's just like I was stuck in that. And so just all these things kind of like came through and kicked me in the face like three times. Phil's ideas, my son wanting to play X-Wing and Star Trek Attack Wing. Those are all things that I was just like, suddenly, finally the lesson came through in my head that there is a space for naval wargaming that is not that kind of cliche sort of game. So yeah, that was kind of how the journey was always kind of percolating in the background, going from company stuff to ground scale things. I'd always wanted to do a larger scale World War II game as well. It's something that's always been kind of in the back of my mind as well. I've got about 1 million games that I want to do, but not enough time. But yeah, the idea of just breaking out into a different space, because again, I think there's not as many people play naval games because of
Oh,
those
that and
preferences.
that's
Yeah.
totally something I want to get into. But
Yeah.
one thing before we transition there.
Yeah.
So you look. It seems that Phil is a huge mentor of yours.
Yep. Yep.
I will never tell him this, but the man's an artist.
Yeah.
He
Definitely.
really is. And he watched. I spoke at Georgetown about wargaming a few weeks ago, and like, I said Team Yankee. I mentioned it there where I was able to try things in that game where I could try them at work.
Hmm.
And I don't know if I upset him or not, but he's like, he really is an artist.
Hmm.
And it's interesting how the completionist. So you have the mechanical engineer
Hmm.
that's with the fine arts major. Um,
Hmm.
he really, there's something about it because I see the stuff that he tells in the boards, as because I'm on the Battlefront back page. When everybody's doing development, he really is. But look, I'm never going to tell him,
Hmm.
so maybe he'll watch this, and I won't have to. But
Yeah.
so naval minis. So you and I were actually just the other day um, on the Naval Wargaming webpage. It has been a love of mine
Hmm.
for a long time. Matter of fact, I wrote my Air Command and Staff College paper on the dreadnought and training,
Oh
where
yeah.
I went with every hit. You want to talk about engineering? I tracked every hit, and I had to defend my thesis with Andrew Lambert at King's College, who's written a ton of books on dreadnoughts and gunnery. So I understand rivet counting, but
Mm.
naval games, they seem to be full of rivet counters that they want to sim, and they never really get there. They forget that these games are supposed to be fun, and you see that a lot where it's like Napoleonics. They fall in love with the system and they love it. And I love the passion because even with the warts, they'll keep playing those games. Nope,
Yeah.
this is the best. Um, Now you're developing a game for that community, which is a rough community.
Yep.
As you go forward with this project, how do you think it's going to do with that crowd? It's a rough crowd.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah, it is hard, exactly as you say, because there's so many games out there that people are well familiar with, and they've had good experiences with, and that's fantastic. And I don't want to take anything away from people who have played those games and they get a lot out of them, especially because it's all social, and as long as you're playing with your friends and having fun, then that's what's important. For me, it's about growing the pie. That's one of the things that Battlefront also taught me was you shouldn't shirk away from competition or shirk away from other game systems just because they're similar to yours. Because what's happening is that you're getting more and more people into the hobby, depending on how you've structured your game. So the thing that I'm kind of quite keen on, like from the very beginning when I sat down and established my design goals, is I wanted to have as few tables as possible. Seems like a real small thing that a lot of people kind of think, well, you can have a few tables in your game. But in my mind, yeah, I needed to have a game that I wanted ideally to have none. It turned out not to be possible to have none. But
Yeah.
I did have my one gunnery table. And that was the thing that I was just a little bit, I was like, okay, if we're gonna make it about the gunnery table, if it's gonna be one, the gunnery table makes sense. But I just didn't want to like get into a lot of more specifics around damage, what happens, all that kind of stuff. Like I wanted to kind of create something that was a little bit more narrative and a bit more engaging. And what I was seeing at the time when I started my project was how successful X-Wing and Star Trek Attack Wing at the time, and then later on Star Wars Armada. Those were the three that have kind of pooled together to kind of really quite inspire what I'm working on.
And
And
you use so in fairness to everybody, I've seen the game he's talking about, and I play tested it once or twice. But the cards is a damage mechanic,
yeah, yeah,
and especially when you're doing certain types of crit damage, old grognards hate cards.
yeah.
One of they do. One of
Mhm.
the things that I said in another, I think it was in the post that you saw as well. Like, look, I understand you guys hate them, but that's what's popular. That's what's picking off. I mean,
Yep.
that's taking off. And to me, if you're going to have a naval game and you don't want it to make it that intensive, use damage cards because it works.
Yeah, yeah, and also like the reason why I went with damage cards was in the end was it tells a story, and I think there's a big point. There's a big thing there's a point in every design when you have to decide what meta story your game is telling. And what I see a lot of games, a lot of naval games, they tend to be quite grand, like they're telling a grand theme, a grand story, and again, that's perfectly fine. Like you've got hundreds of ships, or you're playing Trafalgar, or you're playing Jutland, or Dogger Bank, or something like that, and you've got a lot of ships, or a handful of ships, doesn't matter. It's just one of those things that you're telling a story about a bunch of ships moving around and not maneuvering each other. If that's the story you want to tell in your design, then that's perfect. That's fine. what I wanted to do with Ironclads and Dreadnought, were the two games that I was working on, is I really wanted to tell a story with what was happening on the ships as they were taking damage. So one of the things when I was researching Dreadnought, and it was really interesting to me how um, the lives of the sailors on those ships as it was taking fire, that was where the drama was. It wasn't so much, I mean, there's drama in maneuvering and shooting, all that kind of stuff, but the story I really wanted to get into was what was happening on these ships. Like there's stuff happening, like you see it in Hollywood all the time. There's water rushing in the compartments. There's, people are getting freaked out. There's a fire near the cordite. There's all this stuff that, there's drama in and of itself. And in World War I's perfect example, Jutland, that first day, that race to the south with the battle cruisers, and those battle cruisers just getting hit and going up in an instant and then down in an instant. These sorts of things, like there's you juxtapose that with these ships that are just taking an incredible amount of cumulative damage. I'm sure I'm just speaking to the choir here. You did your thesis on it, but the idea that, like, I was reading a lot of Norman Freeman, and he got really into that sort of thing. Like the idea, the tactics was, nobody believed that they were going to sink a ship through gunnery in World War
Right.
One. It was all about
Torpedoes.
it was about torpedoes. So it was about putting as much cumulative damage on them as possible with your guns. So knocking out all of their guns, their command and communications, their range finding, all that stuff. You knock all that out with all of your weaponry, and then you get in close and finish them off with torpedoes. And that was what was going to sink ships, according to these guys. And so that was when I started thinking and looking at, like, what the tactics were, what exactly what were they angling for, what were the sorts of things that they wanted to accomplish with their tactics and stuff like that. And again, this goes back to Phil, his whole thing of getting throughout the game, you need to be putting the player in the mindset of the people who are making the decisions on the day. So you need to give them those options. So you need to come up with a way to recreate the circumstances, but also, like, let players kind of come up with solutions to historical problems. And that's one of his big things. So to that end, that's where the damage deck came in. So originally my Dreadnought game had one damage deck, just like X-Wing and just like Star Trek Attack Wing. And you just went through that damage deck. And so, yeah, and how heavy your gun was compared to how heavy the armor was determined, what sort of damage you had. What I found with that was it was really, really flat. It actually, like, when I was watching people play X-Wing, but also Dreadnought in the initial projects, I noticed that people were taking damage and they just weren't really caring about it. They were just, oh, just give me a card, give me a card, give me a damage card, until the ship sinks. So basically, that was it. There was no real, like, what's going on here? Like, I wanted people to draw people into the damage cards. That's why I wanted people to be like, oh crap, my ship is taking on a ton of water. It's going to capsize if I take one more flooding token. And I wanted to get them kind of like thinking in terms of the drama of that. Or from the other side, like, oh, if I could just get one more solid hit on their, midships, I could get some, get that one more point of flooding, and then it'll capsize. So I wanted people to be into that. Yeah.
One of the best stories from Jutland is Francis Harvey, who was the Royal Marine that flooded the turret, I think,
Yep.
on the HMS Lion. And if
Yep.
it wasn't for that man's actions, the British could have easily lost that battle. And that's a story that has to come out. And
Yeah.
games at that grand scale miss the Francis Harvey, the 16-year-old that won the Victoria Cross, I think, the next morning off a destroyer.
Yeah.
There's so many of those little stories, and that's why and I don't know how much you want to talk about the game because it's still in development, but as you watch the kind of the crew going through their problems, well, I can tell you this from being somebody, that used to work in a crew community. If my aircraft's on fire, I don't really care about dropping a bomb. I need to put that fire out, and the crew, that's what we focus towards. And that's, with some of the games I've seen, that is missing. It really is iron ships and no men.
Yeah.
And that's, as I was looking through your game and play testing it, I saw that you were getting at a different story here. And that attracted me to it.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was the big thing. Like I really wanted like this is part of gaming in the gap again. Like I think I've identified that pretty early on that that's what I wanted to really bring forward because you just don't see that. Yeah, like you're right. There are a lot of games are about just the ships and they're quite uh, cold and mechanical, right? So you're making the choices of an admiral, and if that's the story you want to tell in your game, that's fine. But yeah, so what changed in Ironclads when I kind of got into Ironclads? Um, I decided that actually it started at the end of the Dreadnought project is what the distinction between cumulative damage and critical damage. And one of the things that I kind of started leaning into and experimenting with was actually 2 damage decks. So if you want to make Grognards upset, add a second damage. That's you get twice as upset. It's fun. But the idea that if you're the way the game is balanced is if you've got lighter guns against heavier armor, you're not going to ever draw from the critical deck. You're only going to be drawing from the cumulative deck. And the cumulative damage will do things to your crew, things like reduce your rate of fire or make it harder to hit your targets, or might start a small fire that if you don't put it out soon, it'll eventually burn its way through the ship. Similar thing with flooding, mild flooding. And if you don't shut that down, then it'll eventually. So I wanted to I'm just bringing forward that kind of that damage control into the game a little bit more, making it a bit more dramatic. And that's what the cumulative cards are all that way. And the distinction between cumulative and critical cards in the game is that cumulative damage you can repair. You can send people down there. You can get people in there trying to repair it, trying to reverse that damage, trying to get a gun back operational. But if you start taking critical damage, and there's a couple ways to do that in the game. One is if you've maxed out the amount of critical damage or cumulative damage that your ship can handle, it starts coming in then as critical. So there's kind of like a threshold. So once you start kind of start taking on too much cumulative damage, then it starts turning into critical damage, and that stuff you can't repair. And that's where things are that's where the dangerous stuff is. So things like magazine explosions, or although there is an explosion, a magazine explosion in the cumulative deck, just one. It just kind of in the Dreadnought version anyway. That kind of just represented that kind of that light touch hit that brought the battle cruisers down. But
and historically, you have there's an historical example of the CSS Tennessee. It wasn't sunk; it was just beaten into submission, and they surrendered. Actually, that is not a unique story. It happened a few times.
Yep.
A good game mechanic has to take that into account of when the crew says, "Dude, Captain, what are we doing here?" Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so with Ironclads, I did a lot of I kind of shifted my decks with Ironclads a little bit because World War I ships, there's a host of ballistic data. There's just a ton of ballistic data, and whether it's accurate or not is another question. But there was something that I could really sink my teeth into when it came to my gunnery and damage. With Ironclads, that's not really the case. It was really like they were only just starting to kind of really get into different types of ordnance that wasn't just a solid shot or a grape shot or something like that. You start having things like shells and bolts and stuff like that, and then they're starting to kind of think about what kind of shells will impact or iron, and which what will it do inside of a wooden ship. So you have an interesting mechanic, of course, where shells are just devastating to wooden ships, but absolutely useless against ironclads. And so you've got some interesting mechanics in there. So a lot of that kind of stuff, I kind of, because that data wasn't there as in kind of a scientific way as it was in World War I, I did a lot. I kind of pivoted Ironclads a little bit more into the crew side of it. So a lot of the damage and stuff has impacts the crew, and so they get to that point where they eventually give up and say, you know what, we're going to strike the colors, because this like the Tennessee, that's the perfect example. Even in on the Virginia, you've got a lot of stories of just incessant hitting of those 11-inch solid shots straight into it. Just that can't have done that can't have done wonders for your head. And also the same in there's a lot of interesting stories coming out of the riverboat ironclads in Memphis or in that area up there. A lot of just cumulative damage just eventually brings the effectiveness of the ship down to the point where it's basically inoperable. And I wanted to kind of capture that in the decks.
Yeah, I dig that. It's one of those things, and this is where the artiste comes in. There's a lot of mechanics underneath the hood of the game, and it's some really great chrome parts, man. And just from reading the game, I figured this is a deep game. So one of the things that you mentioned a few times is we're talking ironclads. We're talking, which were mostly coastal. They happened right next to a port, Mobile, Savannah. But you're also doing river.
Yeah.
Do you find that you needed different mechanics with river, or one game system can do them both? I kind of know the answer already.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Yeah. Well, one system definitely. There was a lot of stuff that I put into it specifically so that the system could handle both of them. There were a couple of pivots that I had to make that weren't. A good example in Ironclads is the ramming mechanics. So the ramming mechanics, there was always a ramming mechanic in Ironclads ever since the very beginning. But because I had such a laser focus on Hampton Roads and how ineffective the ram was against the Monitor, but also just because of maneuvering and all, but how effective it was against the wooden ships, sinking 2 the day before, I knew that ramming was going to be important. What changed was the Battle of Memphis. When I started digging into the Battle of Memphis, and what I call the Ramorama, because it was a million rams. I think there was 5 ironclads, the Union ironclads. They were kind of puttering along, but for the most part, it was like 8 Confederate ram ships, steam ships that have been converted into rams, and I think 4 or 5 Union ram ships, and they just smashed into each other for a couple of hours on the river outside of Memphis on the Mississippi, and it was a bizarre throwback to like trireme battle, like the back to the classic naval warfare, and it was fascinating because I had never really made the connection that that ramming was kind of out of phase or out of vogue because of how slow ships were before steam. And then once steam came in, that just kind of like people kind of reverted, like, well, why aren't we ramming people? And it turns out that there was some pretty severe accidents, before the war, of just steamships ramming into each other, and then the people are like, hang on, this could be this has got military applications. So digging into that ram battle on the Mississippi, that made me think, well, I need to really, really up my my ramming. Like, I need to have something good for ramming rather than just, oh, I bumped into another ship, here's a damage card. Now I've got velocity plays into it, and what angle you strike them, and what
physics are real.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, just trying to make sure that all that stuff is in there so that people know that that it was unique and also very, very deadly as well. So at the end of that battle, all but one Confederate ironclad Confederate ram ship was sunk or captured, and that one last one kind of barely escaped downriver. So it was a decisive battle, and it was also one of the largest ones. I'd never, the largest naval battle in the Civil War took place on the Mississippi. I didn't know that going in. I had assumed that there'd be some skirmishes in Mobile Bay or Charleston Harbor would be interesting, but no, nothing compared to the.
That's a wide river.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I used to live in Minnesota, and we'd visit the Mississippi at Minneapolis, which is already, that's way upstream, and that's already quite wide. So. It's a very big.
I used to go to a bar in Minneapolis, Mississippi Live, and people are like, the Mississippi River goes all the way up here. I go, yeah, believe it or not, it does. And
it keeps going too.
And it goes into Canada. They call it something else. But yeah, there's so much there. And I look around, and I know Tom Gall, who's one of our writers who loves playing Ironclad games. And I said, well, which one should I be playing here?
Mhm.
And he's like, well, and then yours came along, and I'm like, oh, I really want to try this one.
Mhm. Mhm.
Hold on.
Yeah.
So here, I got a message here. Hold on. Yeah. Well,
They-
go ahead. Yeah, I have to take this. It's for the next meeting. So,
Yeah.
I really kind of I dig the rules. Not only do I dig the rules, but I'm always checking back on the Facebook group because the insights folks are giving you.
Mhm.
And there's one guy that, to me, this guy is like, maybe he never wanted to be a game designer, but I know him personally, Miles Reedy.
Oh, yep. Yep.
That guy knows so much
Yeah.
about.
Such a font of wisdom.
He really is. And but looking at like the stuff, people are. I guess it's a good part of kind of our hobby because you got a lot of passionate people,
Yeah.
and they really want to see this game succeed. I
Yeah.
I'm personally very excited for it. The Just going through, it's ironclads, it's tin clads, cotton clads. If it
Mhm.
was a ship in the Civil War, yeah, it's in the game. The only thing you don't have are the Raiders, but this
Yeah.
is not a game for that.
Yeah, I've got it on my radar. One of the interesting things I've been kind of digging into a little bit is the raiding campaign that the Union did on the rivers. So I was thinking actually there's an interesting solo game in there, solo variant. So I've been looking into raiding a bit, but also you've got the duel of the Kearsarge and the Alabama as well. So
Yeah.
I do have plans to bring them forward and add them to the game. But yeah, right now
Ooh.
I'm focused on I'm quite focused on those sort of the river battles, the coastal battles, and those battles around all the bays and stuff. But there's definitely scope for the Raiders. Yeah,
So when will we be able to see this in a store or on a table near me? I know it is the worst question to
yeah,
ask.
yeah,
And if you can give me a year, that would be
yeah.
2021 or 2022 or.
I would love to be able to do that. Like the problem with this particular project is it's all being done in my own time. And it's a one man show at the moment, not including our awesome playtesters who are pulling the lion's weight around the balance and the rebalancing and stuff like that. And Miles has been exceptional and helping me with things like sailing rules, which I had no idea because I've never gone on a
He's a
sailing boat.
great guy.
So the contributors from all over the globe, fantastic work. But yeah, so if getting it out to market, that's a good question. I really I feel like we're really close with the actual rule with the rules. I think I've issued 6 updates currently. I'd like to maybe do maybe 1 or 2 more after a few more playtests come through, especially when I get the Raiders done and the rest of the Riverine stuff done. I want to try. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to add in was uh, uh, a lot of amphibious operations were happening on the along like the Red River and on some of those raids and stuff like that. So I'm actually flirting with the idea of adding in some ground troop rules and thinking about expanding. Or there could be a spinoff for ground troop stuff. To kind of link into it. So a lot of what I drew a little bit of inspiration from Drop Fleet Commander. Um, um, the idea of the thing that I really loved about the Drop Zone and Drop Fleet games is that it made logistics sexy. So getting troops in and out of battle, the whole idea of transports being actually the game as opposed to just a way to kind of get stuff around. That really appeals to me, and so I
Yeah,
have
and
some ideas.
you warm my heart. I spent the last 18 years of my military career as a logistician, and
Yeah,
it's awesome stuff because you also have forts in the game, which a lot of games pretend like they never existed, but they were
yeah.
a huge part of the story of the naval battles of the Civil War.
Absolutely. If you want to have a historical battle with historical ships, then you have to have forts. There's no way. I mean, the Confederates were so outnumbered, but there's a reason why Charleston held out to the very, very end. The ring of forts around Fort Sumter were a very tough nut to crack, and any naval game that kind of ignores that, especially since there were two naval attempts to force the harbor.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that failed pretty miserably. And the Union had everything. They had the new Ironsides. They had like 7 monitors and the Kyok. But the thing is that it's one of those things that was in the game terms. If you were to take those ships and kind of look at the points values of those ships in the game, that's hundreds of points.
Right.
Versus what they had in the harbor, which was 2 really light Ironclads at the time, and eventually 3. And but they were really, really light with only like 4 inches of armor compared to the 6 to 11 inches of armor on the monitors. So like you would never be able to have that game. You'd never be able to say, here's 7 monitors versus 3 terrible casemate Ironclads. There's no game there. So in order to make it a game, you have to have those fortifications. And you also have to have things like upgrades, which is another thing that's kind of, which makes a lot of grognards a little bit grumpy, is when you have things like famous captains that you can assign to ships, or it's more cards, but it's famous captains, it's tricky maneuvers, it's things like David boats with spar torpedoes and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of those sorts of upgrades and stuff like that you need to be able to give to ships, and because they tried all sorts of stuff to break that blockade, and then so you need to kind of incorporate that, torpedoes, underwater mines, that kind of stuff. It's all important. And the same thing with the riverine stuff. You got to have ways of making that balanced. But the game itself is, again, there's a spreadsheet that sits behind it. Another trick I learned from Phil.
Yeah.
That does all of the balancing of points, stuff like that. Put in as much data as I possibly can, and that helps create a balanced point system. So you can create hypotheticals. You can put 10 CSS Virginias against 10 monitors if you wanted to, or you can it's up to you. Like, again, giving players the tools that they need to go away and create their own naval game, or to play their own naval game. That's the goal of a good game design is to facilitate that process, and that's kind of what I'm hoping.
And I understand grogs, they hate the cards. Well, this ship did not have that captain, or it didn't have this. Yeah, but we're not back there. The beauty about wargaming is the what if, and can you build a better mousetrap? And I think gamers forget that. Look, why do you game Waterloo if you know how it's going to end already? Play around with it,
Yeah, exactly. We're not denying you the ability to stick with a historical setup, but we're also not going to deny someone else who wants to try something different.
So
and also,
you're not going to fly back to the United States, go to their houses, and take their dice away.
Exactly. Yeah. Learn that lesson. Learn that lesson a while back.
and a lot of gamers worry about that. And that's something too that I kind of asked the guys from Warlord earlier today, like the balance between, capability and tactics versus history. And it was a softball question because I know they're all diehard historians. Just like, look, if I had a question about the 7th Armored, I know to ask Phil Yates, because he knows that stuff cold. But then how do you gamify that and then make it into a game that's fun? There's that balance there. And, you got to play with the what ifs. So Bill Gray does have a question, and I can unmute him too. Let me see here. I did think of a question. Possibility of Royal Navy or French intervention in the American Civil War versus monitors. What's that? The Glorier and the what was the British iron?
The Warrior. The Warrior.
Yeah.
And it's funny. Within I would say within 10 minutes of me posting my first prototype up, I had the question of where's HMS Warrior, and I was like, okay, fair enough. we can look at that. And plus, like the amount of effort that the Confederates went through to try and purchase the Glorier from the French. They really tried so hard to buy that ironclad and sail it back to the States. And they had some success later on with some other French ironclads and British. The British built a ton of their raiders. But yeah, like there's the what ifs with the ironclads would be really, really cool. I really want to start integrating those as well. The other aspect is the Haitian War. Just after the American Civil War, the U.S. Navy sold a bunch of the old Confederate boats to the Haitian Navy as well. So there's some what ifs down there. So I think it was at the Tennessee. It might have been the Tennessee. One of those ones was sent down there. It sunk on the way down. But what if it had not sunk on the way down and made it in there? So there's a lot of really interesting stuff in this era. This very small gap between what I kind of see is 1865 to 1860 to about 1880. There's some really interesting what ifs in there, and
There really are.
all the stuff that's happening. Even if you fly back a little bit before the Civil War, all the stuff with the French and the Russians and the British in the Black Sea. There's a lot of stuff going on there too. So
Yeah.
yes, this is again, at the very start of this, I really wanted to create a system that could move across different periods with minimal impact on the actual game system. So that's my idea now, because I mentioned a few times Dreadnought kind of didn't quite get up to where I wanted it to get to. But I could see adapting that to match the Ironclads system. Now that I've got a good system for Ironclads, I can see and kind of going forward where the wheels start coming off or getting a bit wobbly is World War II with airplanes. But I'm sure there's a solution there as well at some point. But yes,
and I'll tell you what, if you could do that, I played GQ3 in 1/6000, and I think I talked to you about that. And I do all the mostly night fighting in the Solomon slot. People are like, don't you want aircraft carriers? I go, yeah, look, there's never been a time in history where you were attacking ships with aircraft and they were getting shot at. So it's an either or thing. And, there's just, no one's ever been able to make that work. So with GQ3, I do not use the air rules. I mean, I have the little airplanes, but you kind of have to sacrifice what you really want to get out of a game. And I love the cruiser and destroyers there. If I'm going to go to World War I, it's going to be the big dreadnoughts. But the what ifs, I used to run games at the Historicon, and it was the 1920s with the Japanese 888 ships and the Lexington and the Saratoga as battle cruisers. Matter of fact, I was going to wear it. I have a CC-1 USS Lexington hat, and I always get asked, like, did you serve on that? I go, no, the ship was never, it was an aircraft carrier. Oh, look, it doesn't look like an aircraft. Never mind. But every once in a while, I'll get that guy. And I'm like, oh, you hold on here. I know where that's from. You also have to have fun with these games.
Yeah, you do.
And looking at Ironclads, I said, this is going to be fun. And you've also given me the excuse to get 1/600 Ironclads because there's a guy in Virginia that makes the most beautiful. They're not cheap, and I already got 4 of them. I want to get the new Ironsides next, just because it's such a funky looking ship.
It's so bulky and big. Yeah.
It is. And I guess I'm an engineering tech nerd to a certain degree. And just like thinking about, I don't understand why they didn't do some of this earlier. Like, oh wait, hold on. Let's look at how iron was cast. There's so many interesting things to look at in this period. And I'm excited about this game. And I'll tell you what, you and I probably should do another show, because I could talk to you for hours, my man.
Yeah, happy to do it.
yeah. I mean, it's because you want to go to the next brief too, right? The next lecture with those bozos.
Good, yeah. Yep.
But I want to thank you so much for doing this, and we're going to have you on the podcast, because I think, and now I know. You see, I have a lot of books in my house, and I have, this is just one of like 5 bookcases. But I got a ton of naval engineering books, which for an retired Air Force guy is very unusual. And my wife's like, you need to get rid of those. So now I just have to look at shipping down to Australia and get those to you, because you can actually use that. So where can they find you? Where can they find Scary Biscuit Studio? And what's the best place to get news about? Are you going to call the game Ironclads American Civil War?
That's the working title at the moment. It does compete with an old school board game, but at the moment I'm just going to stick with it.
By Quinto.
Yeah, that's the one. Yep. Feel free to check us out. I'm on scarybiscuitsstudios.com. That's my website. But also on Facebook, you can find Scary Biscuit Studios on Facebook. I got a group there for the page, but also I've got a Ironclads playtest group there, which is open. It's not open to the public, but I let anybody in, anybody who's interested. But yeah, just send a join request there, and I'll preview and get it right in there. But I try
Yeah.
to make sure that if I've got any updates or anything like that, I put them in that group first, and then I'll trickle them onto the website, and then I start looking at adding them to some groups on Facebook and stuff like that when that comes through. So, yeah.
Oh, look, we got somebody. It's probably coming into the wrong room, but yeah, I think it's going to be an amazing game. I love some of the folks that you really have giving you or helping you out. Really have their hearts in the right place. They're not the haters. I think it's. I'm excited for it, and in my time off in December, I'm going to play test the heck out of it. But yes, you're on version 6, and I
Yep.
read them as soon as they come out. And you know, I'm also a grammar Nazi. So
Yep.
I am excited for this game, and I'm looking forward to talking to you again, sir.
All right. Well, thanks for having me.
Hey, anytime. And once again, we're this is Mike Haught from Scary Biscuit Studio, and this is the HMGS Roundtable hosted by No Dice, No Glory. We'll see you soon.